let's talk about those times when you are at a temple open house, or you've gone to the Hilcomore pageant or the Manti pageant or something, and there are people with signs, maybe general conference, and there are people holding signs that are complaining about the church or complaining about the prophets. How many know what I'm talking about? Okay, how many have ever seen that? Yeah, it's kind of awkward. One time, we were just starting an EFY, and the youth were coming to register, and across the street there were all these people with signs. Your parents lied to you. Jesus, not Joseph.com. Joseph Smith is a wolf in sheep's clothing. The Bible says there are false prophets. I mean, all this stuff. They're yelling stuff in megaphones at these kids. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is a bunch of teenagers who are just coming because they want to dance. You know? I mean, they're showing up because they want to hunt zebras, and you're across the road screaming all this stuff at them. What the heck is up with that? Well, first of all, we need to know that that's not a surprise. That kind of opposition is not a surprise. It was prophesied. Let's go to Joseph Smith History 1:33. If you're finding it in your book, it's going to be in your triple at the end, or in your quad at the end, the pearl of great price. You'll see Abraham, you'll see Moses, and then right toward the end, you'll see Joseph Smith History. Then go down to verse 33, and we're going to be talking about when Moroni has shown up, and Moroni is talking to Joseph Smith. Let's see what he says. Anybody have that? Okay, great. Go ahead for us, Caleb.
He called me by name and said unto me that he was a messenger sent from the presence of God to me, and that his name was Moroni, and that God had a work for me to do, and that my name should be had for good and evil among all nations, kindreds, and tongues.
Thank you. So in other words, let's get over the fact that an angel just appeared to him. I mean, that's miraculous enough. But let's look at the prophecy he made. Your name will be known all over the world. Wow. What would be the chances of us just picking out randomly one of you here today? Dun, da, 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 you. Your name will be known all over the world. I mean, what would be the chances of that actually coming true? Here's a poor kid with no education on the frontier out in nowhere land, America, and he's going to be known all over the world? What are the chances of that happening? And yet it happened. And Moroni said, you will be known for good and evil. So when people hold up their signs, when people write stuff on the internet, ragging on Joseph Smith, then you have to remember that that's part of Moroni's prophecy. So it doesn't upset us, because we knew it was going to happen. How do I handle it when I confront those guys at General Conference? They're standing there with their signs and they're screaming in their horns. Well, I just walk by them and I say, thank you for proving Moroni right. Thank you. Thanks for proving Moroni was a true prophet. They have no clue what I'm talking about. They have absolutely no clue what I'm saying. But you know, and I know, they're proving that Moroni told the truth. They're proving that Moroni was the true prophet. And so I say, thank you. But before you buy into all the stuff you're going to read about how Joseph Smith was a con man, Joseph Smith was a fraud, Joseph Smith was a fake, before you buy into all of that, there's a few questions that I think you ought to consider. First of all, if he really was a fraud, how come his family believed him? I mean, your family knows you best of all. How come they believed him if he was faking it? You know? Think about it. Would your family believe you if you came home claiming some of the stuff that Joseph Smith claimed? Would your family believe you, or would they have you drug tested? I mean, would they say, yes, we believe you, but there's a nice little psychiatrist we'd like you to go talk to. I mean, would they believe you? See, William, Joseph's brother, said, we believe Joseph because he was not one to tell tales. He was not one to make up stories. He was not one to exaggerate. So because we knew that, we believed him. Well, think about your own family. How many of you know, absolutely know, which one of your brothers and sisters is going to cheat whenever you're playing a game? Whatever the game is, you know that, look at those hands. Look at those hands. Okay? On the flip side of that, how many of you know, absolutely know, that there's somebody in your family who can't lie? Like, even when they're trying, even when they're like in one of those games and they're supposed to make up 2 truths and a lie, and they can't even do it in a game. How many know what I'm talking about? Okay, you guys, if you know that, don't you think Joseph's family knew that? So how come they believed him? Not just his parents, but his brothers and sisters, his older brothers and sisters? Give me a break. If you came home and said, sorry I'm late, Mom, but we had a flat tire, your mom would believe you. She would say, oh, I'm so happy you're home, darling. I'm so glad you got home safely. Then she'd leave, and what would your older brother say? Yeah, right, flat tire. You wouldn't even know how to change a flat tire. Now, where the heck were you? See, your brother's not going to believe you if you're not telling the truth. You think Joseph's brothers were different? You think Alvin and Hiram were different? They're going to just suck up what their younger brother says if he doesn't have any reputation for telling the truth? The fact that his family believed him is remarkable. The fact that they followed him puts the nail in the coffin. I mean, my gosh, they followed him from New York to Ohio, Ohio to Missouri, Missouri to Illinois, and each time at great personal sacrifice. His sister Catherine actually gave birth on the bank of a river after 3 days of pouring rain. Her mom trying to hold a blanket over her while she's having a baby. Would your sister do that for you? Or would your sister say, have a nice life, make a nice church, I'm going to a hospital and getting an epidural? Joseph's family sacrificed for him. How do you explain that? If he were a false prophet, how come his family believed him? Well, the next thing you need to consider is if he were a false prophet, how come he could produce the Book of Mormon? I don't think somebody who's faking it can whip out a 500 to 600 page book in 65 days. I just don't believe that somebody who's faking it can actually produce evidence. And that's what the Book of Mormon is. Joseph Smith wasn't the only one in frontier America who claimed a vision. When I was in Chile, a man came to me and he said, okay, President Wilcox, I know what you're talking about. There had to be an apostasy. I get it. And that means there had to be a restoration. I get it. But why? Why did it have to be a gringo? See, why did it have to be somebody in North America? I said, well, let's go back in time. Let's go to 1820. Let's say a little Chilean kid goes into a grove of trees, prays, finds out that none of the churches are true, and starts telling people about it. I said, what would have happened to that kid? He said, oh, he would have been killed before the day was over, and probably by the Catholic priests. I said, that's why it had to be a gringo. This was the only country on earth. You guys don't even appreciate that. The only country on earth that had religious freedom. It had to be here. But because there was religious freedom, then lots of people were claiming visions. Lots of people were starting churches. Lots of people said they saw the millennium, or they'd seen the second coming, or they'd seen angels. Lots of people claimed that. So why is it that we remember Joseph Smith, but we don't remember the other people who started their little churches? We don't remember other people who claimed to see angels. So why do we remember Joseph Smith? What did Joseph Smith give us that nobody else gave us? Say it a little louder. The Book of Mormon. Tangible evidence. See, if I say I had a vision, you have to believe me or disbelieve me. You can't go hide behind a tree. We can't go back in time and hide behind a tree and see if Joseph Smith really had a vision. But we can hold this book. We can read this book. We can see tangible witness for an intangible vision. We can't prove that Moroni came or didn't come, but how else do you explain the Book of Mormon? A tangible evidence. That's powerful. And this tangible evidence has held up because it's not writings about the future. Oh, L. Ron Hubbard, Scientology, great. It's easy for people to write about the millennium. It's easy for people to write about heaven. I had a near-death experience and I went to heaven and this is what it was like. That's the easiest book to write in the world because nobody can prove you wrong. Nobody knows. But did Joseph Smith give us a book about the future? No, what did he give us? A book about the past. That opens itself up for scrutiny. That begs people to examine it. And every time anybody's looked at the book, it's held water. Think of the title itself, The Book of Mormon. Say it for me. Everybody together? The Book of Mormon. One more time.
The Book of Mormon.
How many of you speak English? How many speak English as a first or native language? Why did you just screw up? You totally screwed up. You totally blew it. It's not how we speak in English. It's how we speak in Spanish. El Libro de Mormón, the Book of Mormon. It's perfect in Spanish. It's not perfect in English. What would it be in English? Mormon's book. So how come you can count on less than 5 fingers the number of apostrophes that show possession in the entire Book of Mormon? Do we say Laban's sword? No, what do we say? Do we say Mormon's waters? No, what do we say? Do we say Christ's doctrine? No, what do we say? Do we say Jared's brother? No, what do we say? Well, maybe that's just the way Joseph Smith talked. Sure. Come to the house of my father. We will eat the food of my mother. We will play with the sister of my brother. Come on! Joseph Smith didn't talk like that any more than you talk like that. So how come the book's not called Mormon's book? Because he didn't write it. He translated it. He's translated it from another language. He translated it from an ancient language. The title itself is evidence that the book was not written in English. The book was not written by Joseph Smith. Let's take a look at chapter 1, verse 1. You don't even have to look it up because you've got it memorized. Oh my gosh! That's because you've started the book so many times. No, for real, this time I'm reading it. Then you start it again. No, serious. For this time, I'm reading it. Then you start it again. No, pinky promise. I am reading it this time. You have started the book so many times that you have the first verse memorized. And yet, has it ever dawned on you that Nephi was not talking about how nice his parents are? Having been born of goodly parents, therefore I was taught somewhat concerning the languages of my father. Nephi was doing what all ancient scribes did. They explained why they could read and write in a world that was completely illiterate. He's saying, because my parents were rich, because my parents were goodly, because they had goods, because they were wealthy, I was taught languages while everybody else was scrounging for food. That's what all scribes did. How did Joseph Smith know that? If he's just making this thing up, how did he know that? How did he figure out something that you've never even thought about before? And you have a ton more schooling than Joseph Smith. Experts say he had the equivalent of about a 3rd grade formal education. Well, that was one heck of a 3rd grade teacher in Palmyra. I hope she won Teacher of the Year. How on earth did he figure that out? Let's keep going. Let's go to chapter 16. Now, one of the first things you'll notice in that chapter is something you notice throughout the entire book. One teenager said to me, "Hey, I've memorized half the Book of Mormon." I said, "No way, half the book?" He says, "Yes, and it came to pass." Well, I mean, it was a funny joke, but he's actually pointing out something that is an evidence that the book is true. Look at chapter 16. Look at the beginning of every verse. And it came to pass, and it came to pass, and it came to pass. What? Joseph Smith had a stuttering problem? No. On ancient plates, they did not have space, like we do on paper, to start a new paragraph. So instead of starting a new paragraph the way your English teacher tells you to, they would just use a little symbol. One little symbol. And that symbol that they still see in writings in Central America that scholars translate as, "and it came to pass." And that symbol must have been on the plates, or something similar to it, letting people know that this was a new thought without using a ton of space. The fact that "and it came to pass" shows up so often in the book isn't evidence that it was homemade. It's evidence that it was ancient. Evidence that it is a translation. And now let's take a look at verse 34. 1 Nephi 16, verse 34. If you don't have this one marked, mark it. If you don't have your scriptures, write it in your notes and go home and mark it. Why? Because if you're looking for archaeological evidence, none of this pray and find out if it's true, none of this spirit burning in your heart, none of that, just sheer facts, archaeological evidence. This is it. This is our strongest archaeological evidence for the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon. Ishmael died, and they buried him at a place called Nahom. Well, so why is that evidence, Brother Wilcox? Well, because Lehi had named places. Remember, Lehi named a river Laman. He named a valley Lemuel. Do you expect to go to Saudi Arabia and find a river named Laman? No, not in a million years, because when Lehi left, nobody knew that's what he named it. That was a name Lehi gave. But what does this verse say? This was a place that was already called Nahom. Lehi didn't name it. It was already there. So could we go to Saudi Arabia? Could we find an ancient setting called Nahom? Could we expect to do that? Yes, and they did. German archaeologists in the 1980s actually uncovered an ancient site, including 4 different altar stones that all have that name on them. Nahom. How did Joseph Smith pull that off? I mean, let's just imagine Joseph Smith was J.K. Rowling of his day. Let's just imagine that Joseph Smith was George Lucas coming up with the Star Wars Odyssey. I mean, let's just imagine that Joseph Smith was just a really creative writer. So he's saying to Oliver Cowdery, okay, so Ishmael dies, write this down, Oliver. Ishmael dies, and they buried him at a place called Nikini Pana Sunihana Ranapana, Hikikapana Hunahana. If I'm going to make it up, I'm going to make it good. I mean, can you imagine that? Oliver says, how do you spell that, Joseph? Joseph says, oh, for Pete's sake, make it easy for you, okay? Just write Nahom. Can you imagine that? And what would be the chances of about 150 years later them actually finding a site in Saudi Arabia that no one knew about previous to that has this very name on it? Come on. Next time some friend of yours says, Joseph Smith just wrote the Book of Mormon, just smile and say, Nahom. He will have no clue what you're talking about. He'll be like, Shalom. He will have no clue, but you'll know. And I'll tell you what, Until somebody can explain that, until somebody can give me a reasonable explanation as to how that word showed up in the Book of Mormon and then on altar stones, until they can explain that, I'll just stick with my testimony. Thank you very much. If Joseph Smith was a false prophet, how do you explain the Book of Mormon? How do you explain that tangible evidence we can hold in our hand? And how do you explain the fact that he prophesied and prophecies came true? If he's a false prophet, then the prophecies won't come true. But he prophesied the Civil War 30 years before it happened. And he prophesied the exact location of where it was going to begin. Pull that one off. Oh, let's do it. Let's do it right now. What did you do at EFY today, darling? Oh, we prophesied. Went to Brother Wilcox's class. We prophesied. It was easy. How many of you prophesy war in the future? Come on, war in the future. Give me a break. Of course we prophesy that. How many prophesy that it will happen in the Middle East? Wow, wasn't that easy? Wasn't that easy? It's so easy to be a prophet. But how many of us would dare take the next step and prophesy an exact location, an exact site where the war is going to start? See, that would be a little trickier. It would be easier to be found out. Joseph Smith did that, and he was correct. So how do you explain that? How do you explain individual prophecies? Not just sweeping prophecies, but individual prophecies. He prophesied that Dan Jones would get out of jail, that he would go to Wales and become a great missionary and baptize thousands to the truth. Now that's a pretty good prophecy to make, except for the fact that Dan Jones was in jail. Yeah, you're going to get out. None of the rest of us are, but you are getting out. Yeah, Joseph, how's that going to happen? Well, a little while later, the jailer came and said, I need somebody to help me run an errand. You picked Dan Jones, got him out of jail, sent him on an errand. Dan Jones ended up going to Wales. He baptized thousands. He ended up bringing them into the church, just as Joseph prophesied. Joseph prophesied that the saints would come to the Rocky Mountains and become a mighty people. Well, that's an easy prophecy to make when you're getting driven out of Nauvoo. You have nowhere else to go but west to the Rocky Mountains. Easy prophecy. He didn't make it in Nauvoo. He made the prophecy in Kirtland, Ohio, long before Missouri, long before Illinois. How do you explain the fact that he told Willard Richards that bullets would whiz by him on every side and that he would not be harmed? 4 men in Carthage jail. John Taylor was hit multiple times. Joseph was killed. Hiram was killed. John and Willard Richards walked out unharmed. Now what makes that so miraculous? Willard Richards weighed over 300 pounds. Large man, small room. He was by far the largest target in the room. And the bullets missed him. Joseph prophesied that, and it came true. How do you explain that? If Joseph's a false prophet, how do you explain the church organization? How many of you have parents who work in business? Okay, what about medical field? Okay, what about education? How many of you have ever heard a parent complain because the way things at work are changing? Look at all those hands. See, they're all mad because things are changing. So how do you explain the fact that the church organization hasn't changed? It was put in place in Kirtland, Ohio, when there were only a couple thousand members of the church, and the same organization functions today when there are over 15 million. How do you explain that? And how do you explain the fact that it's so unique? Oh my gosh, who's going to be our next prophet? If President Monson died tomorrow, something we hope would never happen, who's going to be the next prophet? Russell M. Nelson. Why? Because in the order of seniority, he's the next apostle. He's the one who's been the apostle the longest. He's the president of the Quorum of the 12. He's 92, and he still goes skiing. I kid you not. And if Elder Nelson died, who would be the next prophet? Dallin H. Oaks. See, you know this. In other churches, they don't know that. They don't know who's going to be the next leader of their church because they have to have votes about it. And we have to fight about it. And they have to have elections. And they have to have conventions. And they have to interview people. And they have to send smoke up chimneys. And they have to do all kinds of stuff that we don't do because our organization is so different. Well, if this were a man-made church, then it would be like all the other man-made churches. The seniority in the Quorum of the 12 is evidence that this is not like other churches. This is made by God. This was not made by man. The organization is unique, and the organization has gone unchanged. How do you explain that if Joseph Smith was not a prophet? How do you explain his life and death? See, some people think, oh, well, Joseph Smith lived one way when he was preaching in public, and he lived another way when he was in private. And that's an easy claim to make because that's what people do today. That movie star lives one way when she's in public and another way when she's in private. Okay? That sports hero lives one way when he's on the television cameras and another way when he's in the privacy of his hotel room with hookers. Right? Oh, that politician, oh yeah, he lives one way when he's talking in public and he lives another way when he's in private, and we're not even shocked. Oh, this so-and-so politician had an affair. Tell us something we don't know. Because we expect people to have a private life and a public life. But Joseph never had a private life. He was always the same. How do we know that? Because he was always a guest in someone's home. He never had his own home except for a short time in Kirtland and a short time in Nauvoo. And even then, his home was a boarding house. People would come and live with them, and that's how they helped to support their family. So that means that people saw Joseph in private, and they saw him in public, and they said he was the same. He didn't put on a show in public. He was consistent. In his private times when he's disciplining his kids, when he's putting his kids to bed, when he's having a disagreement with his wife, he lived the same way then that he lived when he was in public in front of thousands of people. Your parents can't even pull that off. I mean, God bless them. God love moms and dads. But you know dang well that mom can give an awesome talk on family home evening, and you're sitting there listening going, oh, when was the last time we had family home evening? See, Dad can give a whale of a talk on home teaching. You're like, Dad, you haven't gone home teaching for 6 years. I mean, do you see? Do you see how hard that is to actually be the same person in public and private? Joseph was. How do you explain that? And how do you explain the noble way he died? He died for what he believed. No, he didn't. He was murdered. His life was taken from him. No, he died. He gave up his life. If you remember right, he left Nauvoo. He went across the Mississippi River. That was going outside the country. That was like going to Mexico or Canada. He left the country, and he was in Montrose, Iowa, saying, okay, now I've escaped. I'm going to prepare the way for the saints to go west. And some friends came to cross the river, and they said, Joseph, you can't. You can't leave us. He said, if I go back, I will die. No, you've been in jail before. You've always gotten out because you didn't do anything wrong. So just trust the system. And he said, no, I will get killed. And they said, you can't leave us. And he said, this is the famous statement you may have heard before, if my life is of no value to my friends, it is of no value to me. And he went back across the river after having escaped, and he gave up his life. When he rode his horse to the Carthage jail, he said, I am going like a lamb to the slaughter. He knew he would be killed, but he was still willing to go because he was willing to die for what he believed in. Gosh, who does that? What used car salesman is willing to die for the deal of the century that he's giving you? Come on. I used to do hard math problems with my 6th graders. We'd do hard problems on the board. We'd spend a lot of time. We'd finally get an answer. I'd say, is this the answer? They'd all say, yes. I'd say, are you sure? Yes. Are you absolutely positive? Yes. Would you stake your lives on it? Yes. Would you stake your recess on it? No. No way. Where did the reasoning break down? Oh yeah, I'd stake my life on it. That's not important, but not my recess. Oh my gosh, if that's wrong, I'd lose my recess. That matters. Give me a break. Joseph was willing to stake his life on it. He was willing to stake his recess on it. Who does that if you're lying? Who does that if you're making it up? Finally, if Joseph was a fraud, how do you explain the goodness of the people who followed him and who believed him? See, cult leaders feed on stupid people. See, cult leaders feed on people who are stupid because then they're easily led. So is that what we are? A bunch of stupid, mindless sheep being led by our prophet leaders? Is that what the people were who followed Joseph Smith? No. They were ignorant. They weren't educated, but they were not stupid. They were educated. They were bright. They were intelligent. They were hardworking. How many have ever heard stories of Abraham Lincoln? Okay, he grew up in the state of Illinois, and he lived in a log cabin. Oh, everybody knows that in Illinois they were living in log cabins. How come you can find out just a few years later that Mormons were living in Nauvoo in 2-story brick homes? Everybody else in the state's living in a log cabin, but not the Mormons. They're stupid. Yeah, how come the stupid people are living in 2-story brick homes while everybody else is living in log cabins? They built the Nauvoo Temple on the frontier of America without any of the technology that we have today. How many have seen that temple? Even by today's standards, you guys, that temple is impressive. Can you imagine in their day looking at the Nauvoo Temple and saying, what the heck, how did they build this? Do you realize when we rebuilt the Nauvoo Temple, we had to cheat? They have a spiral staircase inside that temple, and we couldn't figure out how the early saints built it. They built it, but we couldn't do it. We had to cheat. We had to put in these steel reinforcements and cover them all up with stone because we had to make it look like what the pioneers did, but we couldn't do what the pioneers did. We couldn't build a staircase without having it cave in on itself. Oh, but they were just stupid sheep. They were just mindless sheep following Joseph Smith. No. Mindless sheep don't build the Nauvoo Temple. They were not stupid. They were bright, and they were industrious, and they were good. Do you realize that in all the pioneer migrations in history, the Mormon migration is unique? Because people built for those who came after them. When people ran off to California to get free land, did they build bridges for people who followed them? No. They just ran off to get rich, and they said, to heck with whoever comes after us. It's one less person I have to compete with. So when they opened up free land in Oklahoma, free land in Oregon, and everybody went flooding west, did they worry about planting crops for who's coming after them? No, that's what the Mormons did. Whole communities, Mount Pisgah, Garden Grove, Winter Quarters, they built communities where they built homes that they did not live in. They built homes for the people who would come after them. They planted crops that they did not harvest. They planted fruit trees that they did not harvest. But they knew people were coming after them who would need that food. How do you explain that kind of goodness if they were so easily fooled? If they were just so easily led? How do you explain that kind of rich, rich goodness? Think about Brigham Young himself. Brigham Young is known as a man who changed the face of the world, even by people outside the church. They recognize that Brigham Young colonized the west of the United States. In some textbooks, they credit him at colonizing 300 communities. In other textbooks, depending on how you define a community, they recognize him for colonizing over 600 communities. Do you realize the size of the state that he first proposed to the United States? He says, we want to join the Union. We will call ourselves the State of Deseret. And how big was it? Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, and California, and Colorado. This is our state right here. The government's like, no, too much power, too much power. And they had to trim it back and trim it back and trim it back. Brigham Young was a man who changed the world. He was a bright man. Nobody would ever accuse of Brigham Young of being stupid. He changed the map. So how do you explain the fact that he stayed loyal to Joseph Smith? Nobody did that in the past. Boy, the pharaohs of Egypt, hey, I'm the pharaoh now. They'd knock down the statues of their fathers and grandfathers. They would take their cartouches, their signatures, and they would hack them off the buildings and write their own name up there. So that's natural tendency. So how come Brigham Young didn't do that? Why did Brigham Young continue to testify of Joseph Smith? Why didn't he say, hey, Joseph, that's old news. It's about Brigham now. Talking Brigham. All right, everybody talk about Brigham. No more talk about Joseph Smith. So that would have been the natural tendency. But how do you explain the fact that Brigham Young's dying words, his last words in this life were, Joseph, Joseph, Joseph? How do you explain that kind of loyalty if he was just a guy who'd been tricked? If he was a guy who'd been conned? How do you explain that kind of loyalty? Not only people of the past, but how do you explain the goodness of members of the church today? You guys let's just be honest. There are some Mormons who are real fruitcakes. I mean, we have got some dingbats in the church. How many know what I'm talking about? Yes. All right? Let's just put it out there. There's some members of this church who are Lulus. All right? They're just really off track. But that said, how many of you know and would stand up in a court of law and testify that some of the best people you have ever met on this planet are members of this church? Look at all those hands. Look at all those hands. You guys, how do you explain that? How do you explain that kind of goodness? How do you explain the greatness of the brethren and their willingness to testify of Joseph Smith? What, because they're mindless sheep? Oh yes, Russell Nelson is a mindless sheep. He was a world-renowned heart surgeon. He invented surgical methods that were so advanced, he flew around the entire world teaching them to doctors in other countries. He's a mindless sheep. Yeah. He really doesn't know a thing, does he? He's just standing up there testifying of Joseph Smith because It's expected of him in his Mormon culture. Give me a break. Dallin Oaks, he was not just the president of BYU, he was a Supreme Court justice before his call as an apostle. Oh, he doesn't know how to tell right from wrong, does he? He sure doesn't know how to look for evidence of truth, does he? No, he only served on the Supreme Court of the state of Utah. Oh, but he's a mindless sheep, testifying of Joseph Smith. Yeah, Jeff Holland, boy, he's brainless, isn't he? He sure doesn't have a mind, does he? Not only was he the president of BYU, but he was the president of the college associations of college presidents for the whole stinking country. Oh, but he's a mindless sheep. He's just testifying in general conference because his mom is there whispering in his ear. I know the church is true. I know the church is true. I know Joseph Smith was a prophet. I know Joseph Smith was a prophet. Oh yeah, somehow I haven't seen Sister Holland whispering in Elder Holland's ear lately. Seriously, people, how do you explain that kind of greatness willing to follow Joseph Smith? How do you explain you? Do you realize that just sitting here at EFY, you're fulfilling prophecy? Joseph Smith said, we would go to the Rocky Mountains and we would become a mighty people. Where are we right now? We're in the foot of the Rocky Mountains. And what do I see? A mighty people. Young people who are willing to come to a church camp. A church camp? Seriously? What do you do at EFY? Read scriptures! What do you do at EFY? Hunt zebras! Come on. How do you explain you? How do you explain the fact that you are going to stand up on Thursday night, and many of you are going to testify, I know that Joseph Smith is a prophet. Wait, you're not mindless sheep. You're smart. You know when somebody's pulling your leg. How many of you know when somebody's teasing you? When somebody's pulling your leg? How many know that? Okay, if you don't, please come see me after, because I have some beachfront property in Nevada that I would love to sell you. Now, if you're wondering why people are laughing right now, come see me. Come see me after the meeting, and we'll just take care of a little business together. See, you guys know. You know when somebody's faking it. Give me a break. How many of you know, absolutely know, when your teacher is being observed by the principal? Oh, look at those hands. She doesn't say one word. You walk into the classroom and you're like, oh my gosh, she's dressed like a human. Whoa, that never happens. And then she smiles and welcomes you to class. Whoa, she never smiles. She never welcomes anyone to class. Whoa, she has an objective written on the board. She never has an objective written on the board. She's thanking people for their comments. She never thanks anyone. Okay, where's the principal? Where's the principal? 9 times out of 10, he or she is sitting right in the back of the room. How many know what I'm talking about? Okay, you guys, you know when someone's putting on a show. You know when someone's faking it. So how come you testify that Joseph Smith was a prophet? The Bible speaks of false prophets. True. But the Bible also speaks of the need for real prophets. True. So if Joseph's the false one, if Thomas S. Monson is the false one, then where the heck is the real one? Oh, we don't need prophets today. Baloney. God got the world ready for the first coming by sending John the Baptist. Now we're approaching the second coming. He's not going to send another John the Baptist. He's not going to send another prophet to prepare the way. How come God would be so changeable? If he did it the first time, he'll do it the second time. And if Joseph Smith isn't that prophet, then where the heck is he? And if somebody has the gall to say, oh, well, he's leading my church, he's leading my little polygamous group out in the middle of the desert, then you just remind yourself, where are the fruits? Where are the fruits that can match the fruits of Joseph Smith? And where are the fruits that can match Thomas S. Monson's fruits? In Joseph's day, he needed bodyguards. But now he doesn't need bodyguards anymore. Now he needs character guards. Because the world is attacking that prophet with a venom and a poison and a hatred that I have never seen. They smear his name and reputation all over the internet. He doesn't need people to protect his body. He needs people to protect his reputation. He needs people to protect his motives. And I challenge you to stand up on Thursday night and you testify that you know Joseph Smith is a prophet. Well, how do you know? How do you know Joseph Smith is a prophet? Because his family believed him. Because we have the Book of Mormon. Because his prophecies came true. Because the church organization is unique and enduring. Because of his life and death. Because of the devotion and goodness of his followers. You stand up Thursday night and you testify of Joseph Smith, and whenever you hear anybody defame his name, you stand as his character guard. And you stand true to the prophet. True to Joseph Smith. I leave my witness that he was not a con man. He was not a fake. He was not a fraud. He was not a hypnotist. He was not whatever the heck he might claim he was. He was a prophet of God. And because he gave us a window that was finally big enough, we can know Jesus. And we can know God. I bear testimony of the truthfulness and faithfulness of Joseph Smith. And I do it in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.